Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 11th meeting of the Public Petitions Committee in 2020. This meeting is being held virtually. First item, consideration of new petitions. First new petition for consideration today is Petition 1790, Parental and Familial Alienation, lodged by Samantha Kerr. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to recognise parental and familial alienation as a specific and serious form of pathological psychological child abuse. We have received 10 submissions from the petitioner, 1 from the Scottish Government and Paul Anderson on behalf of Forever Fathers and Alienated Parents Support Ireland. These are all summarised in the clerk's note. Since our papers were published, further submissions have been provided, 2 from the petitioner and 1 from Paul Anderson. These have been sent to us separately. The Scottish Government submission confirms there is no provision in the Children's Scotland Bill, which, as members will be aware, was passed last week, imposing a requirement in the court to consider the possibility of one parent deliberately turning a child against the other parent in every case. Section 8, however, includes the establishment of a register of child welfare reporters and is envisaged that the training would include recognising situations where a child has been turned against a parent. Training requirements will be set by regulations, and there will be a full public consultation on these criteria in due course. I suppose my own view is, and my own experience is, that this is an issue for families, that a parent feeling that they've been denied access to their child, or that over a period of time the child has been alienated in some way so that contact doesn't happen. And so I'm very aware that it's a very difficult issue for individual parents, individual families. I'll be interested to hear what the committee thinks, but I do think that this issue was considered by the Parliament in the last period, and that Children's Scotland Bill does, in its provisions, allow for an understanding of these quite complex issues within families and relationships. I can't imagine there's anything more difficult than feeling that you've been systematically alienated from your child. And I suppose my own view is I have some confidence that the provisions within the Children's Scotland Act is a means of addressing kind of concerns that the petitioner has mentioned. But I'm going to ask committee members for their initial views, and I kind of start first with Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, convener. This is obviously a very difficult one and a very concerning petition, and very welcome the petitioner's comments and reports, and also the other reports that come in. It is a very sad situation when we have alienation like this, but I think there is a recognition by the Scottish Government of the situation, and of course in the Children's Scotland Bill some of this has been reflected, and also, as we know, it's being considered before by the Scottish Parliament. So I would move to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis of what I've just said, and that the Scottish Government are well aware of it and recognises that parental alienation may occur, and will train the child welfare reporters to identify situations accordingly. Thank you, convener.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, convener. I'll just back up what Maurice says. The Scottish Government has recognised the concerns raised in the petition and are willing to put training into place, so I'm quite happy to close the petition as well.
Thank you. Tom Mason.
I haven't got too much more to add. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the situation is recognised by the government, and the training is possible to take place. And given there's a recent act in place, we really have to see how that transpires. And if there are gaps later, that's to be taken forward maybe much later on when we got to grips with the present situation. So I move to close as recommended.
Thank you. Gail Ross.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, I think I concur with everything members have said. Obviously, it's an extremely distressing and emotional subject, and certainly have full sympathy with what the petitioner is asking for. There was a lot of information, so I'd just like to thank the petitioner for everything that they have given us to allow our consideration of this particular issue. I do agree as well that I think the crux of the situation is the child welfare reporters. It does say that there is going to be a full public consultation on the criteria for the training requirements. So I am confident that that will cover the issues that have been brought up in the petition today. So I am content to close on that basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think my sense is that committee members are very sympathetic to the issues that are highlighted. I think there are complex issues about how you identify where somebody is really kind of quite systematically behaving in a way that alienates a child from their parent, and the difficulties that presents to the parent and to the child. And I would echo Gail's comments that we're very appreciative of all the work that's been done by the petitioner to give us a lot of very useful information, both from, in terms of what's happening both here and elsewhere. But I think as members we're agreeing that this is something that the Parliament has looked at very closely, recognised as an issue here, and that these child welfare reporters will be critical. And I suppose we would be underlining the importance of these child welfare reporters being appropriately trained, and that would involve having an understanding of what's happened within families. And I would also echo Gail's point about the opportunities for the petitioner to engage with the full public consultation around these regulations. She clearly has strong views on this, and I think it would be important for these to be fed in to those regulations so that the training and so on is appropriate. So my sense therefore is that we want to thank the petitioner for bringing this very important issue forward, which can cause a great deal of heartache for families. I think we're acknowledging that the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament has understood that there is an issue here, and they believe that the training of child welfare reporters may be the best way to progress this. So I think what we want to do is to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on that basis. And if anyone disagrees, could they indicate in their chat box? I think that is agreed, and again we would underline and emphasise to the petitioner gratitude for her bringing this issue forward, that we recognise there has been action, but of course, as in all of these cases, if in a year's time you feel there hasn't been progress, there's an opportunity to resubmit a petition to the committee. With that, can we move on to the second new petition for consideration today, which is Petition 1791, Referendum Scotland Act 2020, lodged by Mike Fenwick. The petition calls for the Scottish Government to recognise and respond to concerns that Section 39 of the Referendum Scotland Act 2020 establishes a legal challenge, namely that it breaches protections afforded by the Human Rights Act 1998. We have received submissions from the Scottish Government and the petitioner. These are summarised in the Clerk's note. The Scottish Government believes Section 39, as with the rest of the Act, is compatible with Convention rights, noting, quote, restrictions and timescales for bringing legal challenges are commonplace in legislation for legitimate reasons of legal certainty and finality, which are recognised in Convention jurisprudence. The petitioner notes the Act is the foundation for all future referenda, and its importance therefore cannot be understated. The petition requests that the Scottish Parliament reconsider one element of the Act, Section 39, to ensure in absolute certainty that it does not in any way undermine that foundation. Again, I'm going to ask members to come in on this. My understanding is that when this bill was going through Parliament, there was a debate around this question of timescales, and indeed an amendment by Jackie Bailey, which extended the timescale to 8 weeks. And this is all, parliamentary consideration in the very recent past. My own sense is that this question has been interrogated and tested, and I think that the balance has been, the right balance has been secured in the bill. It's not something that the committee didn't consider at all. It was something that they looked at. But I'm going to call David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government's submission states that the petitioner does not provide details of what rights he thinks are breached by restricted period for a legal challenge set by Section 39, and does not identify any specific breach of the conventional rights in which the Scottish Government can express a specific view. With that, I don't think the Scottish Government is going to change its mind, Convener. So I'm minded to close the petition under Rule 15.7 standing orders on the basis that the Scottish Government do not agree with the action called for in the petition, and specifically that's Section 39 of the Referendums Scotland Act 2020 breaches protection afforded by the Human Rights Act 1998. So I'm quite happy to close the petition, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Tom Mason?
Thank you, Convener. Certainly, certain constituents of mine have raised this issue as well, in as much as they weren't convinced that has been recently passed is comprehensive in this aspect. I would value the information from the Law Society on this. I would like to the Law Society for their opinion, and then allow the Scottish Government to come back and make their comment. So at this stage, I'm not convinced we should be closing it.
Thank you. Gail Ross? I'm not sure if we can hear Gail just now. Can we go on to Maurice Corrie, and we can come back to Gail when we get the connection started again?
Thank you, Convener. I agree with Tom Mason that I think we should get the views and verdicts from the Law Society of Scotland, Convener, and seek their views on what action is called for in the petition and their views on that action and where they stand on it. I would be more comfortable with that rather than closing the petition at this stage, as recommended already by one of our members.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think we've lost Gail just now, but I think what we can do, that the committee is ambivalent. We're not really sure if there's an issue here. Two members have said it wouldn't do any harm to test it by asking the Law Society of Scotland for their views, and I think on that basis we could maybe agree that. I don't know if anybody wants to come in. I'm just conscious that Gail's not had an opportunity to say anything, but perhaps, given that if we decide not to close the petition, at least there'll be a future opportunity for her to comment on that. Would that be agreeable to everybody? It's not ideal without Gail being there. I think Gail's now back with us. Gail Ross?
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you heard what we were saying there. There's an ambivalence about whether there really is an issue here, because the Parliament's looked at it before. But both Maurice and Tom Mason thought it might be worthwhile writing to the Law Society, at least just test the argument for our satisfaction before we close it completely. And I wonder if you have a view on that, Gail?
I don't see that there's any harm in writing to anybody, but I just think that given the fact that, as you said yourself, Convener, that it has been tested at committee stage, it was an amendment that came from Jackie Bailey, and it was supported by everyone in committee, including the Cabinet Secretary. Then it went to the full Parliament. It's been supported at the Parliament. The presiding officer has agreed its competency, and it also, you know, the Human Rights Act 1998 has gives the Scottish courts the right to challenge any act if it thinks that it's contravening the Human Rights Act, and I note that there's no action being taken on that issue so far. So I really don't see that there is an issue here, but I'm not going to disagree to write to anybody. I think that if that's the majority view of the committee, then that's fine by me.
Thanks, Gail. I'm not sure if it is the majority view. I suppose my sense is that nobody seems terribly convinced that there is an issue, but two members feel as if it's worth testing the argument in the interest of not having a division. I wonder if that would be acceptable. If people feel strongly against doing that, then they can indicate. No, in that case, we will write to the Law Society of Scotland to seek the views and the action called for in the petition, but we are aware as a committee that this argument was tested quite strongly as it went through committee. and we can await a response from them. If we can now move on to the next new petition for consideration today, which is petition 1798, review additional dwelling supplement eligibility, and be lodged by Marcus Tate. Petition is calling for the Scottish Government to review the additional dwelling supplement eligibility and relief criteria. The petitioner believes that the supplement is too sweeping in its current form, the eligibility for exemption is too narrow, and that as a result is impacting on smaller developments unfairly. In its petition, the Scottish Government explains that this issue was raised during committee scrutiny of the operation of the additional dwelling supplement 2019. In response, it encouraged stakeholder organisations to provide further evidence. However, no additional examples were provided. I thought this was an interesting petition with an interesting indication of how it had impacted on one person, but I'm also conscious that it would appear from the evidence that there haven't been further examples of how this is as perhaps unjust as the petitioner identifies. So it feels to me that this is something that will be looked at going forward. Anyway, it's going to be tested in the argument. But again, I'd be interested in people's views. And can I start with Tom Mason?
I'm really interested to hear what the committees, other people think on this. But at the moment, I'm thinking closure is that this junction. It seems there's no further examples need to be delivered. So at this stage, closure I think would be appropriate. But I'm an open mind at the moment. I'm writing other people's comments.
Okay, thank you. Gail Ross?
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, in our submission it said that the Scottish Government is already working with Homes for Scotland to try and understand the issues. And I do take your point that it doesn't seem to have been an issue for anyone else. I was interested in the court case that we read about, Bewley v HMRC, where it was ruled that the stamp duty land tax did not apply to derelict buildings, and so I was interested to see about, if there was any crossover there. But I think that the Scottish Government is considering the points in the petition. I'm satisfied with that response, and I would move to close. Thank you. Members, I think that maybe we've lost Joanne. Morris, can I ask you to come in with your comments, please?
Convener, can you hear me all right? Yes, I think you can.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm minded to close this petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis there's no further evidence that's been come forward to the Scottish Government and of any other instances of this particular issue happening. And I believe that the Scottish Government have got a oversight on this, and obviously if further evidence has come forward, if the petitioner would like to raise his petition again in, say, a year's time, I see no problem with that. But at the moment, I'm minded to close the petition. Deputy Convener.
Okay, thank you. David Torrance, please.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with the committee members. I'm quite happy to close the petition and I have nothing else to say on it.
Thank you, David. And Tom Mason.
On balance, I think closing is the right thing to do at this moment. Okay,
thank you. So we're agreed as a committee to close the petition under Rule 5.7 of Standing Orders, because we all agree that the Scottish Government are considering the points in the petition, and we would like to thank the petitioner, and always, as always, they have the opportunity to come back again in a year's time if they feel that their points haven't been addressed. Does anyone disagree with that? Okay, no disagreement, thank you. We'll move on. The next new petition for consideration today is PE 1799, make it illegal to publish a defendant's address in the press, lodged by Sarah McCarty on behalf of families outside. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to make it illegal for any press or media outlet to publish a defendant's address. We have received a written submission from the Scottish Government. The submission states that there is no requirement in law to publish prosecuted persons' home addresses and that media can access a personal address via certain court documentation, providing it doesn't breach data protection or contempt of court rules. Media access to personal information is also subject to a professional code of conduct with the intention of restricting it to situations where it is deemed necessary, as well as being subject to legislation intended to protect the individual. And the courts also have the power to restrict information if necessary. I mean, I think that it could be a massive issue for families if a family member has been remanded or sent to prison and an address is published. It does say in the papers that it's a requirement it's only done to identify, but I think that there are a lot of rules and requirements and standards in place, especially the code of conduct. I just wonder what other members think. If I could go to Maurice Corey first, please.
Deputy Convener, thank you. I'm minded to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of the Standing Orders on the basis that there are, in fact, very clear rules and standards within the legal system and the prosecuting system and the court system where information, personal information or data is not published unless it's specifically required under a judicial judgment by the judge or person in that position. So, and the provision does exist to prevent disclosure of such materials as it addresses by law when considered necessary. So I'm happy that there is a solid system in place that allows this not to happen. And if it should happen, obviously the hand of the law should come down on it. But I am content to close the petition at this stage.
Thank you, Maurice. David Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. We'd back Maurice on this. I think we should close the petition because there is a professional code of conduct there and there's legislation in place as well. I think that there's all the measures are put in place to protect, if it's needed, individuals. So I'm quite happy to close the petition.
Thank you, David. And Tom Mason?
Thank you, Deputy Convener. I'm of the same view that there is sufficient codes in place to prevent unnecessary exposure of addresses, and there are occasions when this is necessary, but it's deemed round the right way in my mind, and therefore closure under 15.7 is appropriate.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So based on the discussion, I think we're proposing to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that there is an established professional code of conduct, standards and underlying legislation with the intention of ensuring that journalists do not publish personal information such as addresses unless necessary to identify someone, and that provision does exist to prevent disclosure of such materials as addresses by law where considered necessary. Do any committee members disagree with that? Thank you very much, members. Now I believe we have the convener back. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say, I don't know what was mentioned in the last petition, I agree with the decision that was made, but that Mary Fee MSP had indicated her support for that petition and had been unable to attend today as she has another committee meeting instead. But thanks, Gail, for taking over. I'm assuming we're now moving on to the next petition, which is petition 1800, am I right? On expanded remit of the Lands Tribunal for Scotland. This next new petition for consideration today is petition 1800, expand the remit of the Land Tribunal for Scotland, lodged by Siobhan Sampson on behalf of Bowness Community Council and Grangemouth Community Council, including Skinflats. The petition calls for the Scottish Government to expand the remit of the Land Tribunal for Scotland to include the consideration of planning decisions which are currently called in by Scottish ministers. In her written submission, the petitioner explains that while they do not object to Scottish ministers being able to call in planning applications, they do not believe that they should be able subsequently to decide on these applications. In its submission, the Scottish Government states that planning is established as a process where decisions are appropriately made by elected representatives, usually at the local level and in some cases by Scottish ministers. It also explains that the role of Scottish ministers in the planning process was recently considered during the passage of the Planning Scotland Act 2019. I suppose my own view is that I think a balance struck between individuals, local communities, and I suppose if one of the issues is if people have not managed to persuade folk of their view, they feel that the process can be unfair and independent, and it's difficult to see how you could give people that confidence. I think the other issue is that when Scottish ministers make a determination, they have to do it on the basis of planning legislation. They can't override it. They have to give an explanation that has to fit in with planning, the law, and all the guidance and stuff that goes around about it. But I'm going to ask members for any comments or suggestions, and I'll start with Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I'm minded to close this petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis simply that we have 3 stages in our planning process. We have obviously the local council. If that is not satisfactory to the applicant, then there is due process to take this to the minister via the Scottish reporter, and beyond that there is the opportunity for judicial review. And I'm minded that, as I say, that the Scottish Government is well aware of this and obviously understands it. But I think there's enough checks and balances in place at the moment within our planning procedures, and therefore I would seek to close this petition.
Thank you, Maurice. David Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. I would agree with Maurice to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders, because this has recently been visited during the passage of the Planning Scotland Act 2019, and consequently the Scottish Government is not minded to seek any further changes in this area. So I don't think the Government's going to change it anyway, so I'm quite happy to close it.
Thank you, David. Tom Mason?
Convener, yes, I mean, this situation has been considered very recently, and there is ample opportunity in the planning process for local communities to participate. The problem is, and I've said this before on other matters, the participation early enough in the planning process, unfortunately, is not taken widely enough, and people wake up too late in terms of their objections. And I think it's necessary, although the process is a semi-judicial one, subject to a planning process and regulations, that the input of the political activity at various stages is important. Otherwise, there is no accountability. It becomes entirely one of detailed fact, which is inflexible. So, in terms of that, I think closing at this stage is the appropriate action.
Thank you, Tom. Hugh Ross?
Thanks, Convener. Yes, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said on the planning process and the individual's right to have several stages of appeal. I also think that it's important to say that in the Scottish Government submission, they've got a consultation at the moment that says it's conducting a consultation on the future of the Scottish Land Court and the Lands Tribunal for Scotland, which proposes that they be merged. And one of the questions is, should that merged body take on more functions? So I think that possibly that's an avenue for the petitioner to feed in their views, and I would just like to put that on the record. And certainly, you know, this along with the other comments that have been made by other members, I would say that I'm content to close as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think there is a consensus that there are concerns about having people having confidence in the system, that there needs to be early engagement, as Tom has indicated, but also that the Parliament has looked at this very recently and has concluded that there does have to be that balance of decisions. I think we're agreeing then, and I think Gail's point about the consultation on the Lands Tribunal and so on is something that maybe the petitioner might want to take up, but I think we're agreeing to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that the role of the Scottish Ministers in the planning process was recently explored during the passage of the Planning Scotland Act, and consequently the Scottish Government is not minded to seek further changes in this area. This is always an alive area, I think, so it will be, there's no doubt in future that MSPs and representations to them will mean that planning is continued to be something that people pay attention to. So unless people do, we are agreeing to close this petition, and we want to thank the petitioners for taking the time and effort to contact us in these important matters. The final new petition for consideration today is petition 1801, Retain Powers of Economic and Industrial Intervention, lodged by Vince Mills on behalf of Radical Options for Scotland and Europe. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to negotiate with the UK Government to ensure that in any future EU withdrawal agreement, Scotland retains the power to provide state aid to workplaces threatened with closure, take public utilities such as rail, bus and power fully back into public ownership, and require public sector contractors to recognise trade unions and collectively bargain wages. We have received a written submission from the Scottish Government and from Unite Scotland, and these submissions are summarised in our Clerk's note. And since the meeting's papers were published, the Clerks have also been alerted to an email from the petitioners which strongly advocates the views of the STUC on this issue. My own view, I think there is an issue here. There's an interesting argument that I was very alive to during the debate round leaving the European Union, that the one area where I found there was an argument was the way in which state aid was constrained, and that sometimes procurement was very lengthy and complicated and expensive. A local housing association having to, for example, make sure that the European Journal had notice of what they were doing, and we had examples in our own, around ferries and so on, procurement. And I would like to see a procurement policy which did allow for more than just simply looking at cost, but was able to look at things around standards around employment and so on. I think that there is an interesting issue here, but and I'm very mindful that the petitioners are keen that we at least flag this up to the STUC and get a response from them about something that they will have looked at perhaps in more detail. I'm going to ask people to make a contribution and start with David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I'm quite happy if the Committee writes to the Scottish Trade Union Congress seeking their views on what the petitioners call for. It will be interesting to see the views there, and also to the Scottish Government to see their commitment to it. I know they have actually says in their statement to us that they're committed to retain the current powers, but like yourself, I would quite happy to see procurement where other factors are taken into concern when we're bidding for contracts.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Tom Mason.
I'm fairly open for persuasion on this. I would have thought that the situation is clear enough in terms of what is being negotiated and what is available there, and I don't think the various standards and things are going to be decreased because of various negotiations. But in fact, if you feel it's necessary to have more information from TUC, then quite happy to receive that.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I would also like to seek the views of the STUC. I think the petitioner was argued his case very well in the email that he sent as an additional point. And I think the Scottish Government are very alert to what's going on, and they have told us on numerous occasions, both to the petition and made it obvious in Chamber through various debates, that they are extremely committed to see this through. But I agree with the points that yourself and David Torrance have raised, and I would write to the STUC calling for their views. Thank you.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie?
Thank you, Convener. I'm minded to agree there with the other members that we need to get the information back and views from the Scottish Trade Union Congress, STUC, and I would be happier having sought their views on this and any actions that they see as appropriate to take. It is a fairly contentious subject, but also we need to get it right.
In that case, I think there is agreement that we think is worthwhile exploring this point. I'm agreeing to writing his Congress, seeking its views on the action called for in the petition. And I'm taking that as agreement. Okay, in that case, can I suspend for 5 minutes? We'll come back maybe just at, that's 11 minutes past 10, 12 minutes past 10. We can reconvene then. Thank you. Can I welcome you back to this meeting of the Public Petitions Committee, and just to indicate that there have been technical problems which have meant that I'm not showing video, which is perhaps a bonus for everybody concerned. And I will continue in audio only to make sure that we can facilitate the discussion rather than ending up pausing. So the continued petition for consideration today is petition 1517, polypropylene mesh medical devices, lodged by Elaine Holmes and Olive McElroy on behalf of Scottish mesh survivors, Hear Our Voice campaign. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to suspend use of polypropylene transvaginal mesh, TVM, procedures, initiate a public inquiry and/or comprehensive independent research to evaluate the safety of mesh devices using all evidence available, including that from across the world, introduce mandatory reporting of all adverse incidents by health professionals, set up a Scottish transvaginal mesh implant register with a view to linking this up with national and international registers, introduce fully informed consent with uniformity throughout Scotland's health boards, and write to the MHRA and ask that they reclassify TVM devices to heighten alert status to reflect ongoing concerns worldwide. The petition was last considered in September 2019 when the committee agreed to write to the Scottish Government and Dr. Veronicas, an obstetrician gynaecologist based in Massachusetts, USA. The committee has received a submission from the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport and 2 submissions from the petitioners, which are summarised in our papers. Since our papers were circulated, the clerks have received a subsequent submission from the petitioners. A copy of this has been provided to members. In this submission, the petitioners express how little confidence they have in the surgeons on National Mesh Removal Service, and that mesh-injured women would be able to attend a surgeon of their choice, should be able to attend a surgeon of their choice, including Dr. Veronicas. Members may wish to note that the committee has invited Dr. Veronicas to make a written submission on 3 separate occasions. However, a submission has not been provided. Members will also note that earlier this week, in a statement on the Scottish Government programme for government, the First Minister announced the establishment of a Patient Safety Commissioner. This is in response to recommendations from the Cumberledge Review, which, as the papers note, was commissioned as a result of concerns about a number of treatments, including mesh implants. And obviously this is a petition that we've dealt with over a significant period of time. I personally welcome very much the decision to establish a Patient Safety Commissioner, but my own sense is that a lot of this is how it then is taken forward. There's been so many occasions with this petition. There's been some progress, setting up a review and so on, and then people have been very disappointed with the outcome. And the petitioners continue to be, I think, both concerned and frustrated at the lack of progress and confidence that they have about the implications of what was done to women, the lack of information, concerns that it may still be ongoing, but also concerns about whether they can get the surgery they need from somebody that they have confidence in. So I think there are further things that we can do around this petition. I'm going to ask Tom Mason to speak first.
Thank you, Convener. This issue has been running way before I started in the Parliament, and I've been sitting on the cross-party committee, cross-party group as well. And the stories we hear are quite horrifying in terms of the suffering that certain patients have been through. We do need to make some progress and get some assurances. I would like to we need information from the government and assurances, but I think those assurances have to be given in person. I would like. Is it possible that we can call the cabinet secretary in for giving some more assurances to this committee that they are going to carry through the requirements, and likewise make sure that they have the understanding that the patients have confidence in their system, and because unless this confidence is maintained, it'll just continue to be open. So that, if I leave that thought with the committee at the moment, but certainly we need to make sure we get government assurances that they do have the confidence of the patients. even if it's only done in writing.
Thank you.
But an interview might be worthwhile.
Thank you. Gail Ross?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, as you have both stated, an extremely important long-running petition. I absolutely agree that we need more information from the Scottish Government about its response to the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review report. I think it's essential that we get that feedback. I'd also like to hear more feedback about the establishment of this Patient Safety Commissioner, what their role is going to be, what timescales are we working to here, with the well, we know the background, but the remit and where the government see this heading. I would also like to know how they're continuing to work with the petitioners, because obviously they are and continue to go through hell with this situation, and it's only right and correct that they are involved in every step of the process. I think that writing to the government first to get a reply on these points before we maybe call the Cabinet Secretary in, but certainly there are questions to be asked about the situation with Dr. Veronicus as well. I mean, I would quite like to know why this hasn't happened, and I don't think that we've had an answer to that yet, and it is disappointing that we've written on 3 separate occasions and we haven't had anything back. So I think that that's another avenue that we would need to be asking more questions about. But I would write to the British Government on those points in the first instance and then take it from the reply that we get. Thank you.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie?
Convener, thank you very much. Yes, I agree with what Gail Ross has said, and I would support everything she said on that. I also would agree with Tom Mason about the requesting the Cabinet Secretary come to speak to the committee and update us and explore if there's any resistance to the Dr. Veronicus coming across from the Scottish medical sector. And I'd also ask to have before us the Scottish Government's Clinical Director as well, Dr. Jason Leach as well, because I want to get to the bottom of this in relation to where does the medical profession in Scotland actually stand on this, because I think it's very disappointing we're not getting a response from Dr. Veronicus in this event, and therefore I think we need to try and push to get that. But I think I'm in agreement with both members have said, but I'll go one step further and ask the Scottish Government's Clinical Director to appear before us as well in that basis. And I think the other point that Gail Ross said was a question about the Patient Safety Commissioner and the timescale when that will be put in place. And I do welcome Professor Cumberridge's review, and I'm glad that the Scottish Government has paid cognizance to that. But I think this is such a long-running and urgent problem that we do need to really get this flushed out. Thank you.
Thank you. David Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. As somebody who was a member of a committee when this petition was originally brought before us, I've watched the work that the committee's done, how petitioners have continually raised their concerns and highlighted them to the committee. I've also watched how MSPs in the last Parliament and this Parliament have raised the issues. The committee even went to European Parliament to give evidence on mesh implants. So I'm still quite concerned and still need reassurance that this is going to be taken forward and that the petitioners are going to be happy with the outcomes of it. So I would agree with every one of the members before that we do need the Cabinet Secretary in front of us, and we do need to write to the relevant authorities for confirmation of what's happening, because it seems to have dragged on and dragged on and dragged on. Because I thought, as an original member of the committee, this petition would have been finished and everything that had been done a long time ago. And I really feel for the mesh survivors and how long this is taking. So I'm quite happy to have the Cabinet Secretary in front of us. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, David. I think there's a consensus we want to hear from the Scottish Government. I think the question is how most productively we can do that. I don't have any hesitation about asking the Cabinet Secretary to come before the committee, but I think it would be useful to get a report from them first about how, as Gail has indicated, how this new commissioner will work, what other work has been done round about it, what contact they've had with Dr Veronica, because I know there's a great deal of unhappiness about the fact that that hasn't been progressed. And at some point, I think we would want to have the Cabinet Secretary and the Clinical Director or whoever it would be in front of the committee to answer these questions as indicated by Maurice Corey. I think on the question of Dr Veronica's not responding, in a sense he has no responsibility to respond to us. I mean, he has been engaged with Scottish Government, but it would be interesting to know where that has gone, while recognising this will be a very busy man who doesn't really necessarily feel he has a responsibility to deal with a huge issue that I think has been recognised in Scotland and way beyond Scotland. So perhaps a compromise position would be to try and get a detailed response from the Cabinet Secretary around precisely what the programme is around this, how this is going to get taken forward, and then and clarifying what the role of where the current discussions with Dr Veronica's are, and flagging up that we would at one point want to hear from the Cabinet Secretary, because if they have made progress and if they have established the Patient Safety Commissioner, it would be interesting to know timescales and so on for that. But that is a good story for them to be able to tell the committee as well, and may give petitioners some confidence. So I think we all recognise we want to continue the petition. We do want the Scottish Government to give us a detailed response to the Independent Medicines and Medical Device Safety Review report, not just to say that they've established a commission, but how that would look, what timescales are and so on. And critically, as Gail I think has highlighted, the importance of how they're going to engage with the petitioners who clearly remain at best cynical about what is happening given their own circumstances. Would people be content then to seek that response with a view to having them in front of the committee at a later stage? Again, if people disagree strongly, they could indicate. Now, I'm taking that as assent, but I think we recognise, as David has said, this is work that the Public Petitions Committee has engaged in over a long time, and it's evident that, globally, there's a recognition now that there have been this is a health scandal, I think. Okay, if we can now move on to the next continued petition for consideration today, which is petition 1756, review housing legislation to protect people experiencing domestic or elder abuse, lodged by James Mackey. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to review current housing legislation in circumstances where a non-tenant has been responsible for domestic or elder abuse. We have received submissions from Shelter Scotland, the Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers, ALICO, Chartered Institute of Housing, CIH, the Scottish Government, and 2 from the petitioner. These are summarised in the clerk's note. The submissions received from stakeholders focus on domestic abuse and highlight work that has been undertaken by CIH Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, Shelter Scotland, and ALICO. I was very struck, I think, by the number of responses that we got, that this is something that clearly people have been, these organisations do regard as important and serious and worthy of further action. And I think that I would like to see the committee taking this forward, partly because it is clearly tapped into something that organisations already recognise as an important issue, and it may be that we can work through some of the ways in which that can be addressed. In terms of members, can I ask Gail Ross first for her comments?
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I was also struck with the in-depth and amount of submissions that we got, and all very, very helpful. It was interesting to see that the Scottish Government has asked the CIH and Scottish Women's Aid to chair a working group to improve housing outcomes for women and children at risk of domestic abuse, and I believe that the group will hopefully report later this year. And there's also work ongoing to review how local authorities can use current tenancy agreements as a means of removing perpetrators rather than the victims from the family home A lot of information to get through and a lot of work currently underway. So I agree that we need to find out more. I mean, I think it would be really important for us to find out from the Scottish Government whether legislation, existing legislation, could be extended to provide the protection that the petitioner is asking for, and are there any you know what I mean? Are there any steps in legislation that are needed to end joint tenancies where both a victim and a perpetrator are both named on the tenancy agreement? And I would also, given the elder abuse side of things, want to write to Age Concern Scotland and Action on Elder Abuse, seeking their views as well on the action in relation to that particular point. But yes, just to thank the petitioner again, very important subject, and agree to take it ongoing with that work. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, convener. Yes, I fully support what Gail Ross, my colleague there, has said in taking this forward, and I think it's quite a complicated subject. I've actually was a guardian in a situation where we had this problem, but in actual fact it was in an owned house, wasn't in a tenanted house, but very, very similar issues, and it was a very difficult situation to remove the perpetrator, and it only happened because he tried to assault a carer and eventually was removed physically by the police from the property. But we had an awful job in trying to get this process through the local authority and the care support organisation. So I do think it's a very serious point, and I think it's only the tip of the iceberg. So I would purely simply back what has been said in the question of writing to the Scottish Government, writing to the Fife Council for further information, and to key stakeholders such as Age Concern, Age Scotland, and Action on Elder Abuse, because I think this is something that's really needs to be looked at. But I would say that not just tenancy, there are some issues I have experience of, particularly in a private home, where the local authority was involved, and frankly, it was really very bad in the fact of the time taken to sort this problem out.
Thank you very much. David Torrance.
Thank you, convener. I agree with all the committee members. I don't think I have anything else to add to that because they've covered all avenues, but I was taken back by a number of responses, the quality of responses to the petition. So I'm happy to agree with everything that's been said so far.
Thank you, David. Tom Mason.
Lena, I haven't got anything more to add. It is a complex issue, and we really do need to make some forward progress around the issue. So I agree with the panel. We'll just seek more information from the various stakeholders and government, so we can make some forward decisions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we have got agreement and consensus that this is an important issue, that we are struck by the quality and importance of the submissions that have been given and the importance of the issue, and we would act as has been indicated by other members about who we write to, but both looking at the whole question of looking for good examples from Fife Council, recognising it's domestic abuse but also elder abuse, I think has been highlighted, and it's something we would want to take forward on that basis, and we look forward to getting responses in that regard. If we can now move on to the next petition for consideration today, which is petition 1757, reduce actuarial reductions to Scottish Local Government Pension Scheme, lodged by Liz Maguire. The petition is calling on the Scottish Government to significantly reduce the levels of reduction to the Scottish Local Government Pension Scheme to ensure that today's low-paid workers do not become even poorer pensioners. Since our last consideration of this petition, we have received submissions from the Scottish Government and the petitioner. The Scottish Government submission notes Scottish ministers adopt the principle of financial neutrality when setting the actuarial factors used to work out the reduced pension payable by the Scottish Local Government Pension Scheme on early retirement. The petitioner notes that this does not explain why Scottish ministers take the view that the advice of the actuary is to be adopted without question and fails to make any reference to the fair and just society which Scotland seeks to have. They also note the Scottish Government response fails to acknowledge that the rise in the state pension age has effectively increased the level of reductions which were in place prior to the new regulations introduced in 2015. I think this is one of these complicated issues. I don't pretend to understand pensions terribly well, but I am struck by the fact that women in low-paid work, probably heavy work, physically demanding work, may want to take it early retire, and certainly the argument is made here quite cogently, I think, that they then become disadvantaged because of the reductions that are made in order to balance this notion of financial neutrality. So I would want us to take this forward and ask, to try and get an explanation from the government why they haven't acknowledged that the fuel ground pensions has changed in terms of the state pension. I'm going to call Maurice Corrie.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. Yes, this is a very interesting one, and it's something that's been bubbling away for a little while now. And I think we should write to the Minister for Public Finance and Migration to ask, whether the consideration has been given to changing calculations for the local government pension schemes in Scotland, and given that the state pension age, etc., has risen since the regulations were introduced in 2015. But I also would ask that we write to COSLA as well, because that is important. We get their view on this as well, so we get a balanced picture. And also to understand from the Minister whether they agree women are disproportionately affected because of this. And obviously in relation to the heavy work, which you, Convener, highlighted, and I agree with you on that, in relation to maybe retiring a bit earlier. So we need a balance. And I think there may be some issues to look at what happened with Glasgow City Council recently in parity of pay, and obviously that would be pensions as well. So a lot of things here we need to get before we can take a considered view on it, I think. But those are my views, and I do think we should involve COSLA. Thank you.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Like you, it's a minefield, pensions, and I don't agree to understand it all, but I think the concerns here are just. I feel for low-paid workers who in the end will end up possibly as low-paid pensioners, and I'd agree to invite Minister for Public Finances to write to us and raise all the concerns with him. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Tom Mason.
I haven't anything more to add. I agree with what's been said so far. There are gaps in the information we have received, and these need to be closed. So to write to the government and COSO would be the right idea at this stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Nothing more to add. I think everything's been covered. There is obviously an anomaly there, and that we need to find out why the levels haven't changed, given that the state pension age has risen. So I would agree to write to both of the mentioned people. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. I wonder if I could add one suggestion, that we actually ask the government whether they've looked at whether the way in which the scheme operates now on a unisex basis, and that men and women are assumed to be affected the same way. Have they done an equality impact assessment, and has given the disproportionate number of women in low paid and physically demanding jobs? It may be that actually all balances out, but it would be, I think, worth asking. I think we're agreed that we want to write to the Minister of Public Finance and Migration, and that we write about this question. I'm assuming there's a consensus in that, but if anyone disagrees, no, in that case that action is agreed. Can we now move on to the next continued petition, which is petition 1799, Equal School Hours for All Children in Scotland, lodged by Susan Crooks. Petition calls on the Scottish Government to ensure that all children receive the same teaching hours across the whole of Scotland. We have received written submissions from the Scottish Government and COSLA. Both make the point that local authorities have responsibility for the delivery of education services in their area, to provide a service relevant to the local area, resources and circumstances. is also discussed and is even more pertinent now given the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Scottish Government has highlighted that there are legislative parameters within which local authorities must operate, such as the requirement for each local authority to provide 190 days of schooling per year with discretion over the length of the school day. COSLA states that it is more important to focus on outcomes as opposed to inputs and outputs such as learning hours, and also that there is no educational evidence which draws a link between a longer school week and better attainment. I thought this was an interesting issue. I think both the Scottish Government and COSLA want really to say there's nothing to see here, but actually, are we seriously saying that you can provide 190 days schooling without defining what a school day is, or within limits? I mean, could you theoretically end up only offering education in the mornings because your resources don't allow anything different? And while I accept there may not be a direct educational link between a 2 hours difference, it can't be argued surely that a couple of hours a day would be sufficient and there would be no impact on educational attainment. I'm actually interested in whether it may have a disproportionate impact on children in disadvantaged areas if they ended up with reduced hours, given the importance and stability of school for some young people. But that's my sense of it. It's not so much about this particular issue of this 2 hours, but I thought that the argument in response wasn't as substantial as I would have wanted. But I would welcome comments from members. So I'll start with David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I'm tended to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders because the Scottish Government and COSLA do not support the actions called for in the petition, and the state that local authorities should have the flexibility to make appropriate and local decisions. And I think that's key for me because there's different circumstances across all local authorities. So I'm quite happy to close the petition on that. And I know there's other evidence there that the Scottish Government has and will put legislation in place if there's sufficient evidence deemed necessary to have these longer days. So I'm quite happy to close it.
Okay, Tom Mason.
Thank you, Convener. I would like some more information on this, what the drivers are for outcomes, and before, whether it's appropriate to give flexibility or there has to be more direction. But we haven't got the information on what the drivers are. So I think writing to the government where their evidence comes from as to what determines the number of hours. And so more information required at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Jill Ross.
Thank you, Convener. So obviously the council that's mentioned is the Highland Council, and that is my council. I remember when the change was made, it was specifically stated that children in P1 to P3, it was believed it's difficult for younger children to concentrate for large numbers of hours in the day, and I guess it depends what people think that they are actually missing out on, because there is a school of thought that says that it's more, or it could be more influential for kids to actually have more playtime than it is to have sit-down lessons at that age. So it was thought that, and obviously it says in the petition as well that our transport system is quite different from a lot of other local authorities. There were questions asked by parents at the time. There was a big issue about childcare, because if you've got a young child finishing at 2:30, and then you've got another child in a different age group that's finishing at 3 o'clock, there's obviously a disparity there about picking up one and then having to go back and pick up the other one. So a lot of schools started offering after school clubs where the younger children could stay in and get that play aspect, and that solved a lot of the childcare. I don't think that that there is any evidence, as it says in the papers, to suggest that any of the children in Highland that are getting 22.5 hours as opposed to 25 are missing out on anything. In fact, I think that there is a lot of agreement that perhaps they are benefiting because they're not having to concentrate for such a long time. I think we have all the information that we need. If other members feel that we need more information by writing to whoever, then I'm happy enough with that. But I do think that we have enough information here to close the petition. And I'm satisfied that what is happening in Highland is not disadvantaging our children. Thank you.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. This is an interesting one, and having been a councillor in a rural area in Argyll and Bute, I know the issues which Highland Council have been going through, and particularly with children who have to be transported back to the islands and more remote rural communities, allowing time for that. And I take your point, Convener, of the disadvantages of children who may not have the opportunity for the full hours of education. And I think that's something to be looked at. And also I agree with Tom Mason as well, that we need to have some more evidence. Now, we may close it obviously in due course. I just feel we're a little bit short of some of the information, and maybe get some more information back from other local authorities who are more municipal local authorities, and obviously other rural authorities, because I know this is an issue in my old council area, and it's all about trying to, and I accept what the Scottish Government wants to do, is to allow local authorities to have the flexibility to make appropriate local decisions. And I'm all for localism, no question about that. But I think there's something here, and I'm interested to hear your comments, Convener, particularly having been a teacher, on this, and I would support some more evidence come forward, and we may need to discuss how we do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My one feeling is that there may be an argument for this level of flexibility, and I hear very much what Gail says about different circumstances and different local authorities. They have not, in their argument, addressed that. I mean, you know, logically, to say, well, there's not any evidence that's a change in educational attainment. Well, at what point would there be? How short would the day need to be before it became a problem? And I'm all in favour of local flexibility and local decision making, but if it's because of financial constraints, which is also flagged here, then you can start building in disadvantage, because a local authority which is under massive pressure financially may say, well, we can reduce hours. And I do think for some families, childcare does matter. It's not the primary role of education, clearly, but to have, I would have thought even in Highland, Gail will know better than me, that to some of our more remote areas, there'll still only be one bus going. So even if the child is finishing early, they're going to wait for the one bus along with their siblings, perhaps, to head back home. So, and I don't think anybody's suggesting that, you know, it should be, you know, that you're sitting at a desk and learning that way. There's lots of flexibility and play learning and so on that can also be involved. So I suppose my one sense is that I think that that I understand the argument that actually the evidence is, what's been said here, is not to detriment, and that there needs to be flexibility. But I would fear that if that was then taken as logical conclusions, what is to stop that gap breaking up? And I just would like to ask that question. I think Gail is wanting to come in.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thanks. Well, just on that point, Convener, why don't we write to the Highland Council to ask them for the specific paper that went to members when that decision was made? And I think that we'll get a lot of information from that. And also, just to put on the record that teachers are contracted to 22.5 hours a week of face-to-face teaching time. So I don't think that the argument of, if we left it up to local authorities, you know, would we only get however many days teaching, or you know, they are contracted to do face-to-face hours. So I don't think that that would be a worry, hopefully.
But thanks, Gail. It may be that I'm just a bit more sceptical that you could stretch these 22.5 hours over more children. It's not that anybody is intending to do that. I just think that the logic of the argument I'd like to know, where is the balance between the local decision making and the basic standards that parents can expect or carers can expect? And that's really the only question. I think Maurice is wanting to come back in.
Yes, Convener, thank you. Yes, I agree entirely with what you just said there in that last point. And I also feel that we need to be very careful. It's not one size fits all. And that's why I say that there are very different dynamics in each area. And I would be much more comfortable if we can get some more evidence and more information on this, please.
Okay. I think that what Gail suggests is interesting and important, because clearly there was a thought-through argument and discussion, and people were content with it. And I think it would be useful to see that. And I think we could write to Highland. We may want to write to other rural local authorities and remote authorities who might have a view in this as well. I'm sure that what happens in Shetland and Orkney, given transport constraints, will be quite difficult as well. And I suppose I would quite like us to go back to Scottish Government and see what are the constraints on that flexibility. And I'm sure this is not to suggest in any way whatsoever that local authorities would do anything other than they have to do with the resources that they have. I think we recognise that too. I wonder if that's agreed then, that we can. We're very conscious that while this has been flagged up as a Highland issue, it's the more general issues we want to examine here, because clearly from what Gail has said, that was a thought-through policy. So would that approach be agreed? Disagrees can indicate? No. In that case, thank you for that. Can we move on? The next continued petition for consideration today, which is petition 1760, clear pricing for train fares, lodged by George Ecton. The petition calls for the Scottish Government to ensure that a requirement of future rail contracts is for customers to be given information on the cheapest possible fare as a matter of course. Since the petition was last considered in December 2019, the committee has received written submissions from the Scottish Government, the Office of Rail and Road, the Advertising Standard Authority, Rail Delivery Group and ScotRail. A written submission has also been received from the petitioner, and these submissions are summarised in the clerk's note. I'd be interested to hear what other committee members have to say on this one, but I do think there remains an issue that there should be full transparency, and I was quite taken by, I think, the comments made by the petitioner in saying that the example that was given of why this would all be very complicated and you would be constrained by timetabling challenges kind of missed the point, which was it is possible to travel from point A to point B and have quite disparate fares for the same journey. And so, I think we could probably close the petition, because it looks like the Scottish Government is going to address this in future rail contracts, but I'd be interested in what other colleagues have to say. And can I start with Tom Mason?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I mean, the situation has been sort of taken on board. So, and there are some issues that are going to arise out of the COVID pandemic situation that has been running, with transport being a bit of a mess. So we need to see how it transpires. And I suspect there will be review of various contracts as a result of that. So I think at this stage, I think closing is an appropriate way. Otherwise, this petition will be open for several years. And then I think when the situation has steadied itself, petitioners can take an additional view if they think it's appropriate. So closing at this stage would be appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Gail Ross?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I agree. I think I was struck by the statement from the Rail Delivery Group that says that current fare system is complex and in need of drastic reform. And there was a good couple of examples about how you could get from A to B with different stops on different trains, and you might end up getting there maybe 10 or 15 minutes later, but you would save quite a considerable amount of money. So I suppose it depends what your priorities are. Is it pricing or is it timing? I think that it will be interesting to see the findings and recommendations of the Williams Rail Review, but the Scottish Government have said that they are looking at ways of fairer pricing. So I'm content to close this petition on that regard. Thank you.
Okay, Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, convener. Yes, I'm of the mind to close the petition, but I pick up a point there from Gail Ross about the Williams Rail Review. I think that's important that we hopefully feel that will be redressed, and certainly that's covering UK-wide. And the comments by the Rail Delivery Group Managing Director and Customer Experience was horrendous about 16 million different train fares. Well, I actually tested it out some time ago down to going the south of England, and I got 4 different tickets, and I did save money, about £12, but it was a bit of a carry on trying to get the tickets organised, and you know, the staff at the local office said, yes, I mean, we wish we had a simple system. So it's endemically wrong, and we need to get that right. And I'm hoping that this system will put right. So I think we do close it at the moment under 15.7 of the standing orders, and hopefully the Williams Review will highlight these issues and certainly get them the amendments written into the new rail contracts, because frankly, at the moment, it's a farce. Thank you.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, convener. I agree with my fellow committee members to close the petition, and I have nothing else to add.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I do think that, I mean, I was quite struck by the kind of defensive approach. Oh, well, this is all very complicated. You might want to get cheaper, but actually, you know, you might miss your train and so on. And I do think there should be a more proactive approach to making ticketing easier for people. We're going to have to get people back onto public transport. This is one of the reasons quite often for long journeys that people choose to fly rather than go by train, because it's all so complicated. I just think that I got a bit of a sense that it was people trying to justify the current system, when I think particularly Petition has made a very clear case for why it's not justifiable. I do think, though, however, as a committee, we're looking to close the petition, given that the Scottish Government has indicated in future rail contracts there should be an obligation placed on the operator to provide customers with clear, straightforward information on all fare options. I would like to go a wee bit further and say they should maybe look at why do they have to be complicated in the first place. But in closing it, I think we would want to acknowledge the importance of the issue that the petitioner has highlighted, that if there isn't progress in the next year, this may be something that the petitioner would want to bring back, but it's also there are other options around lobbying individual parliamentarians, particularly as elections come on, in terms of concentrating people's minds. But this is something we think is important. We think probably in terms of our added value to this work, we have done as much as we can. We may perhaps in closing the petition just flag up to Scottish Government, we do think this is something that we would want them to see, to be quite strong about, because it aims to ensure maybe, you know, a bit more flexible than we would want. And I wonder if members are agreeing, therefore, that we do close this petition on that basis. But that we do recognise, as I've said, there is an issue here. We want to thank the petitioner very much for the work that has been done, and of their right, of course, to come back to this if they felt it's not been addressed properly within the next year. If we can move on now to the final continued petition for consideration today, which is petition 1761, New Housing Regulations, lodged by David Murphy-Shaw, which calls on the Scottish Government to establish new housing regulations by replacing current planning regulations with a regulatory framework governing prefabrication properties and companies, allowing property taxes to take account of the property location, size of plot and number of children living at the property. And since the petition was last considered in November 2019, the committee has received a written submission from the Scottish Government, and this submission is summarised in our meeting papers. Again, I think there are interesting issues here, and I'm reflecting on whether there is any further we could do. I think that part of the issue is that the Scottish Government has indicated that they don't think this would be the right approach, and are very clear on that. It's whether that's something through the Petitions Committee we can address, or whether actually this will be a matter for public debate at a later stage. But I'll call Gail Ross first.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one because most of the points that the petitioner has put forward, the Scottish Government has actually not agreed with. So in terms of where we are as a committee, I find it really difficult to find another avenue that we can go down on the petitioner's behalf. I do agree. I think that there are a lot of things in here for debate, not least the subject of the council tax and, you know, a possible land tax. I think that that's been on people's minds now for a number of years, as we know. I think, unfortunately, as you suggested, that, you know, we have probably taken this petition, interesting though it is, and I thank the petitioner for that. We're bringing up a lot of points that I had never even considered before, but I do think that we have taken that as far as we can, and obviously the petitioner has the chance to take it back in a year's time if they feel that the points are still ongoing, but I do think that under Rule 15.7 we should close this petition. Thank you.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I'm minded at this stage to close the petition under Rule 15.7, the standing orders, on the basis of what's been stated, and my colleague there, Gail Ross, has said it. I think this is an issue that may come back with the petitioner in a year's time, and they're certainly welcome to do so. But I think there's a lot of movement going on in this whole business of buildings, and we saw the private members bill by Graham Simpson, OSP, to better address for purchase of new build homes, and that was to extend the guarantee on developers so that people are getting assurances that the houses are of quality and of substantial, are according to design and technical specs. I think there is an issue generally at the moment because we're seeing more of these kit-built houses and how they're done. And I think there's a fair comment by what the petitioner said. But I do think at this stage we should probably close this petition at this stage, but I would expect probably it might come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I support closing the petition at this stage because if the Scottish Government's not going to agree with the actions called in it, it's not going to go anywhere. So I'm quite happy to close it.
Okay, thank you. Tom Mason.
Thank you, Convener. This, to me, was rather a confusing petition in terms of it mixing up planning with taxation and trying to link people how they use the property as opposed to what the style of the property actually is. And I was noted that there was no further submission from the petitioner after the government made its comments, which would have interpreted some of the issues. But on balance, I therefore think we should close it at this stage.
Okay, thank you very much. I think my sense is that there are issues here. No question of a land value tax and so on will be interrogated in the elections next year, and whole complexities of taxation and housing regulation. I'm sure these will be issues that will be part of the more general political debate over the next few years. So it's not that this question disappears simply because we're not going to be debating it further. But I think that the committee is agreeing at this stage, given how near we are to an election. I think that the fact the Scottish Government says it does not agree with the actions called for in the petition means that it won't be progressed in this term, but it may be that it will be something that's discussed further in the election itself, and of course the petition may be able to bring back the petition at a later stage if they felt that was worthwhile. I think we're agreeing to close the petition, and people can indicate if they disagree with that, but we would want to thank the petitioner again very much for highlighting some quite significant issues, I think, around housing regulation. And if that's agreed, we've now reached the end of our agenda for the day. Can I thank everyone for the participation? It's always a bit of a challenge to do this virtually, and my apologies for the weakness in our link, that I have been just a voice for the last bit of the meeting, and I hope the public will understand that. And with that, can I close this meeting?